It was 6:30 a.m. on March 1st, 1943. The coral runway at Port Moresby, New Guinea, was slick with rain. Standing amidst the tropical downpour was Major Ed Larner, the 31-year-old commander of the 90th Bombardment Squadron. A veteran of 72 combat missions, Larner was not a man easily rattled, but the scene before him carried a heavy weight. He watched silently as his ground crews hoisted 500-pound demolition bombs into the bellies of his B-25 Mitchells, preparing for a mission that higher command had essentially designated as impossible. The intelligence reports were terrifyingly clear. A massive Japanese armada had departed Rabaul, 8 destroyers escorting 8 troop transports, their holds packed with nearly 7,000 reinforcements bound for Lee. The stakes could not have been higher. If those troops made landfall, the Allied advance in New Guinea would grind to a halt, devolving into a catastrophic bloodbath of jungle warfare. Larner's orders were simple but daunting. Stop that convoy at sea. However, Larner knew that courage alone couldn't change the laws of physics. The mathematics of high-altitude bombing against moving naval targets were brutal, and they heavily favored the Japanese. A B-25 flying at the standard doctrine altitude of 10,000 feet had to release its ordnance miles before actually reaching the target. From that height, a 500-pound bomb required approximately 37 seconds to freefall to the ocean surface. In the chaos of combat, those 37 seconds were an eternity. A Japanese destroyer traveling at 30 knots could cover 380 yards in that time, a distance spanning more than 3 football fields. The Japanese captains were masters of this deadly geometry. They would watch the American formation approach, calculate the release point, and simply kick their rudders hard over. The bombardier would aim at where the ship was. The bomb would explode helplessly where the ship used to be. Larner had spent 8 months watching this doctrine fail. Reconnaissance photos returned time and again showing tight, disciplined patterns of bomb splashes in an empty ocean, while the Japanese ships kept sailing. The 5th Air Force was bleeding aircraft and crews for zero strategic gain. In February alone, Larner's group had lost 4 bombers trying to penetrate the dense flak screens of Japanese convoys. 40 men, gone. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners had all the time in the world to track the high-flying bombers, calculate the lead, and bracket the formation with lethal shards of steel. The tool Larner had for this fight was the North American B-25 Mitchell. It was a solid medium bomber, but it had been designed by factory engineers in California for a very specific, civilized type of warfare. Fly level, utilize the sophisticated Norden bomb sight, drop the payload, and go home. Its glass nose compartment housed a bombardier and a single, flexible 30 caliber machine gun, a weapon that was notoriously prone to jamming and utterly useless against the armored hull of a warship. The flight manual was explicit. The B-25 was not a dive bomber, it was not a fighter, and it was certainly not a low-level attack aircraft. But the war in the Southwest Pacific wasn't being fought according to the manual. It was being fought by desperate men in terrible conditions who were rapidly losing the initiative. Ed Larner was done with the old rules. He was about to take the B-25 manual and tear it into pieces. The impetus to overhaul their tactics wasn't born merely from cold statistics. It rose from the ghosts haunting the humid airfields of New Guinea. Every squadron commander carried a mental roster of the names. Men sacrificed to the B-25's woefully inadequate forward firepower. There was Captain Robert "Shorty" Perkins. On January 15th, Perkins attempted a low-level strike on a Japanese freighter off Samoa. As he closed the distance, the Japanese deck gunners unleashed a barrage of 25 autocannon fire. Perkins had only his single, nose-mounted 30 caliber gun to answer them, a pea shooter firing rifle-caliber bullets that ricocheted harmlessly off the freighter's steel hull. The Japanese shells didn't bounce. They tore through the B-25's unarmored glass nose, killing the bombardier instantly and severing the hydraulic lines. Perkins hit the water at 160 miles per hour. The entire crew was lost. Then there was Lieutenant David Hurlbut. He was intercepted by 3 million Zeros while limping back from an aborted mission over the Owen Stanley Mountains, the jagged, treacherous route pilots simply called the Hump. The Zero pilots knew the B-25 suffered from a massive blind spot straight ahead. They lined up on Hurlbut's nose and executed punishing head-on firing passes. Hurlbut's gunner returned fire until his weapon jammed, a maddeningly common failure of the gun's complex feed mechanism. Left defenseless against the 20 cannons of the Zeros, Hurlbut's plane was chopped to pieces in midair. These senseless losses infuriated a man named Paul Irvin Gunn. Everyone knew him as Pappy. He was 43 years old, a chain-smoking, hard-drinking former naval aviator who had cut his teeth flying biplanes in the 1920s. When the war broke out, he had re-enlisted in the Army Air Forces. On paper, he was supposed to be a transport logistics officer, quietly organizing cargo manifests in Brisbane, Australia. But Pappy Gunn had a personal stake in this war that transcended logistics. His wife and 4 children were trapped in Manila, held prisoner by the Japanese in the brutal Santo Tomas internment camp. Pappy Gunn had no interest in moving cargo. He wanted to kill the enemy, and he was searching for a machine efficient enough to do it in wholesale quantities. Gunn looked at the B-25 and saw wasted potential. The twin Wright Cyclone engines generated a combined 34 horsepower, enough raw thrust to haul massive loads. The airframe was rugged, but that glass nose was a death trap, and the bombardier sitting inside it was dead weight during a strafing run. Gunn envisioned a completely new kind of aircraft. He wanted to plate over the nose with solid steel. He wanted to remove the bombardier entirely, and in that empty space, he wanted to mount an arsenal that would make an infantry battalion jealous. He drew up blueprints for a B-25 carrying 4 fixed 50 caliber heavy machine guns in the nose, complemented by 4 more mounted in external blister packs on the fuselage cheeks, 8 forward-firing heavy machine guns, a combined rate of fire of 64 rounds per minute. He took his rough drawings to a team of visiting engineers from North American Aviation. He expected enthusiasm for his innovation. Instead, what he got was a condescending lecture on aeronautical physics. The meeting with the factory representatives was a disaster. They viewed Gunn's rough sketches with the same disdain one might show a child's crayon drawings. Out came the slide rules and the rigid technical specifications for the B-25C airframe. They laid out the physics of why Gunn's idea was essentially a suicide pact. First, they pointed to the center of gravity. Cramming 4 heavy machine guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and slab of steel armor into the extreme nose of the aircraft would shift the balance point dangerously far forward. They calculated that the nose wheel strut would snap under the static load before the engines even turned over. Even if he managed to claw the bird into the air, it would be terrifyingly nose-heavy, requiring the pilot to hold constant, exhausting back pressure on the control yoke just to keep from diving straight into the earth. Second was the issue of structural integrity. The aluminum skin of the B-25 nose section was engineered to slice through the air, not to absorb the violent recoil of heavy ordnance. A single Browning M1250 caliber machine gun generates approximately 500 pounds of recoil force. 4 of them firing in unison would hammer the nose frame with 1 ton of reverse thrust, 10 times every second. The engineers predicted the vibration would pop rivets like buttons off a shirt, buckle the aluminum skin, and potentially rip the entire nose section off the fuselage in mid-flight. Third was aerodynamics. The external cheek, blister packs Gunn wanted to bolt onto the sides of the plane would ruin the aircraft's drag coefficient. They would churn up turbulent airflow over the wing roots, drastically increasing the stall speed and rendering the aircraft unstable at low velocities. the exact envelope where Gunn intended to fight. The lead engineer snapped his notebook shut and delivered the official verdict. The modification was lethal. It violated every structural load limit in the book, and it would never receive factory approval. They forbade him from attempting it. Their message was clear. Let the engineers design the planes, and let the pilots fly them according to the manual. Pappy Gunn nodded politely. He stood there and waited for the engineers to board their transport plane back to the United States. But the moment their wheels lifted off the tarmac, he walked straight into the main maintenance hangar at Eagle Farm Airfield in Brisbane and reached for a welding torch. Pappy Gunn operated without a single factory blueprint. He had no authorized parts. What he did possess was a boneyard littered with the skeletons of wrecked aircraft and a team of mechanics who were sick and tired of writing condolence letters to the families of dead aircrews. They began by scavenging. They ripped Browning M12 machine guns from the wings of P-40 fighters that had crashed on landing. Since armor plate was impossible to acquire through official supply channels, they drove to the Brisbane docks and torched steel plating right off the hulls of derelict cargo ships. Lacking preformed ammunition chutes, they tore the flexible heating ducts out of damaged transport planes and hammered them into feed tracks. The fabrication process was brutal, a round-the-clock marathon that violated every safety protocol and maintenance regulation in the Army Air Force's manual. The hangar air hung thick with the acrid blue haze of arc welding and the ear-splitting screech of metal grinders. Gunn knew the engineers had been right about one thing: the recoil. If they simply bolted guns to the aircraft skin, the torque would rip the plane apart. So, they transformed the inside of the B-25 nose into a fortress. They welded heavy steel channel beams directly to the fuselage longerons, creating a rigid gun deck in the space where the bombardier once sat. They staggered the mounting of the four nose guns, positioning two slightly ahead of the others, in an effort to dampen the destructive harmonic vibration of simultaneous firing. For the cheek guns, they had to cut directly into the fuselage skin. The mechanics physically winced as they took power drills to the pristine factory aluminum, boring holes for mounting bolts that were never meant to be there. They fabricated external blisters from scrap metal to streamline the guns, beating the aluminum into shape with hand hammers over wooden blocks. Then, they routed the firing controls. The trigger solenoids were wired directly to a button on the pilot's control yoke. When the pilot depressed that button, 8 solenoids would slam home, unleashing a storm of lead. They loaded the ammunition bays, 400 rounds per gun in the nose, 300 for the cheek guns, nearly 3,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition sitting just feet in front of the pilot's knees. When they finally rolled the first modified B-25 out of the hangar, it looked like a completely different species of aircraft. It sat dangerously low on its nose gear, the oleo strut compressed almost to the bump stops by the immense weight. The smooth glass nose was gone. In its place was an ugly, blunt snout of painted steel, bristling with gun barrels. It looked heavy. It looked crude. And it looked like exactly what the engineers said it was, a disaster waiting to happen. The first test flight took place in late December 1942. Gunn himself climbed into the pilot's seat to tame the beast he had created. The aircraft felt sluggish just taxiing to the runway, the nose dipping so low it felt as though it were dragging along the concrete. He held the brakes and ran the twin Wright Cyclones up to full takeoff power. The plane shuddered violently against the restraint. He released the brakes. The takeoff roll was terrifyingly long, the runway disappearing beneath him while the heavy nose refused to lift. Gunn had to haul back on the control yoke with both hands, physically bracing his boots against the instrument panel for leverage, just to rotate the aircraft. It finally staggered into the air at 110 miles per hour, mushy and unstable. The engineers were partially right. The aircraft flew like a brick. It required constant, exhausting back pressure on the stick just to maintain level flight. If Gunn relaxed his grip for even a second, The nose dropped instantly into a dive. Landing required a fast, shallow approach. A standard flare would cause the heavy nose to slam down first, collapsing the landing gear. But it flew. Now came the real test, the guns. Gunn flew out over the Coral Sea to a desolate, uninhabited reef used as a gunnery range. He spotted a jagged coral head sticking out of the water, about the size of a small boat. He entered a shallow dive, lined up the crude iron ring-end bead sight he'd bolted to the dashboard, and armed the solenoids. He squeezed the trigger. The reaction was violent. The aircraft felt like it had flown directly into a brick wall. The airspeed indicator dropped 15 knots almost instantly from the sheer recoil force of 8 heavy machine guns firing forward. The cockpit immediately filled with the bitter, stinging smoke of burning cordite sucked in through the vents. The floorboards vibrated so intensely that Gunn's feet went completely numb on the rudder pedals. But the effect downrange was apocalyptic. 8 streams of armor-piercing incendiary bullets converged on the target at 400 yards. The water around the coral didn't just splash. It churned into a white froth of steam and debris. The coral head itself simply ceased to exist. It was vaporized by a chainsaw made of lead. Gunn landed back at Brisbane, physically exhausted from wrestling the heavy controls. The mechanics swarmed the aircraft. The damage was evident. The aluminum skin around the nose was wrinkled from stress. Several rivets near the gun mounts had popped their heads. The vibration was indeed tearing the plane apart. Gunn didn't stop. He ordered heavier gauge steel reinforcements. They doubled up the mounting brackets. They added dampeners. He adjusted the elevator trim tabs to their maximum limit to help offset the nose-heavy flight profile. He handpicked 12 select crews, teaching them how to fly the heavy beast, how to muscle it off the runway, and how to ride the violent recoil during a firing pass without losing control. By March 1943, he had a squadron of 12 Frankenstein monsters ready for war. General George Kenney, the commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, decided to gamble. He ordered Larner's squadron to intercept the massive Japanese convoy headed for Lee using Pappy Gunn's experimental tactics. The Japanese convoy was finally spotted at 8:15 on the morning of March 2nd in the Bismarck Sea. It was a massive target array, 8 transports surrounded by 8 hardened destroyers. The Japanese captains were alert. Their lookouts spotted the American aircraft approaching low on the horizon, silhouettes hugging the water. The Japanese assumed these were torpedo bombers. Standard defensive doctrine dictated turning the ship's bow on towards the attackers. This presented the narrowest possible target profile, making it difficult for a torpedo to track and hit the hull. The destroyers swung around, their bows cutting through the swells, pointing directly at the incoming B-25s. It was the worst tactical mistake they could have made. Major Larner led the attack. He wasn't carrying torpedoes. He was flying Pappy Gunn's commerce destroyer. He leveled off at a terrifying 200 feet above the water, pushing the throttles past the red line to 280 miles per hour. The Japanese destroyers opened up with everything they had. 5-inch deck guns and 25mm autocannons threw up a wall of steel and water in front of the bombers. But the B-25s didn't pull up to bombing altitude. They just kept coming, straight down the throats of the destroyers. At 1,000 yards, Larner lined up on the lead destroyer, the Arashio. He squeezed the yoke trigger. The result was a massacre. The 8 nose guns unleashed a combined stream of 100 rounds per second. The destroyer was bow-on, meaning there was no armored belt to protect it. The fire raked the ship lengthwise from stem to stern. The bridge crew of the Arashio was wiped out in the first 2 seconds of fire. The thick glass windows shattered into dust. The officers and helmsmen inside were cut to pieces by high-velocity armor-piercing rounds. The anti-aircraft gun crews on the open forward deck were obliterated before they could even traverse their weapons. The sheer volume of fire punched through thin steel bulkheads, ignited ammunition-ready boxes, and turned the superstructure into a colander. Within seconds, the Arashio was out of control, burning fiercely, its decks a slaughterhouse of dead gun crews. Larner didn't stop. He shifted targets to a 6,000-ton troop transport, the Teyo Maru. Its decks were crowded with hundreds of soldiers in khaki uniforms who had rushed to the rails to watch the supposed torpedo attack. Larner's gunners mowed them down in windrows. The transport's wooden decks splintered under the impact of thousands of incendiary rounds, starting uncontrollable fires. Then, Larner executed the second part of Gunn's new tactic: skip bombing. He released two 500-pound bombs from just 50 feet above the water. The bombs hit the surface, skipped like flat stones across the waves, and slammed squarely into the waterline of the burning transport. The 5-second delay fuses triggered massive underwater explosions that broke the ship's keel. The battle became a rout. The Japanese convoy fell into absolute chaos. They had no defense against this. Their manuals offered no solution for a bomber that attacked like a heavy fighter. You couldn't dodge a strafer that was flying faster than you could steer. You couldn't shoot back when your gun crews were dead before the enemy was even in range. In 20 minutes of concentrated violence, Pappy Gunn's impossible aircraft had broken the back of the Imperial Japanese Navy's reinforcement effort. Inside the cockpits, the pilots were riding a wave of euphoria. They felt untouchable. But as they banked their machines for the long flight back to Port Moresby, the unforgiving laws of physics, the very ones the factory engineers had warned them about, began to collect their due. Lieutenant James Slick Brandon had pushed his strafer to the absolute limit. He had executed 5 separate firing runs, emptying his magazines into the hulls of 3 different enemy vessels. But as the adrenaline of combat faded, a new and unsettling sound cut through the steady drone of the engines, a sharp, high-pitched metallic rattling that was rapidly growing louder. Brandon's co-pilot glanced out the window toward the right engine nacelle and saw a nightmare scenario unfolding. The aluminum skin on the cheek of the fuselage, exactly where Pappy Gunn had bolted the external gun blister, was flaying open in the slipstream. The structural violence of the recoil, compounded by the G-forces of high-speed maneuvering at wave-top height, had fatigued the metal past its breaking point. The rivets had sheared off completely. Now the wind, rushing past at 200 miles per hour, was getting underneath the loose panel, stripping it away from the airframe like the rind of an orange. The vibration escalated from a shudder to a violent shaking, fighting Brandon for control of the yoke. The danger was critical. If that skin peeled back any further, it would disrupt the airflow over the wing route. The wing wouldn't just stall, the turbulence could snap it off the fuselage entirely. They were still 300 miles from base, flying a heavily damaged, unstable aircraft over an open ocean teeming with sharks. Brandon had no choice but to throttle back, slowing the plane to 160 knots to reduce the aerodynamic pressure, praying the few remaining rivets would hold. The crew desperately lightened the load, jettisoning everything they could. Empty ammunition cans, the waist-mounted machine guns, and even their own parachutes were tossed out the hatch to keep the heavy nose aloft. The return journey was a 2-hour exercise in pure terror. Every pocket of turbulence felt like it might tear the nose section free. When Brandon finally kissed the wheels onto the coral strip at Port Moresby, the right cheek blister was dangling by a mere shred of metal. Underneath, the fuselage frame was cracked. The aircraft was total scrap. It would never fly again. The strafers worked, but the strategy came at a brutal mechanical cost. They were literally tearing themselves to pieces to win the fight. Despite the alarming structural damage sustained by the aircraft, the after-action report that arrived on General Kenny's desk that evening altered the entire trajectory of the Pacific Air War. The data contained within was nothing short of staggering. In a single engagement, the squadron of 12 modified bombers had successfully sunk or crippled all 8 destroyers, along with a dozen transports and cargo vessels. The human toll was horrific. Estimates placed Japanese troop losses at over 3,000 men, drowned or killed before they ever had a chance to reach the shore. In exchange for this devastation, the Allied forces lost a total of 4 aircraft, 2 brought down by flak before the strafing runs commenced, and 2 others, like Brandon's, that were written off as scrap due to catastrophic structural failure upon landing. The kill ratio was unprecedented. The report famously described the strafers not as aircraft, but as scythes cutting through wheat. General Kenny wasted no time dispatching the combat gun camera footage, and the pilots debriefs back to North American Aviation in California. The same factory engineers who had condescendingly lectured Pappy Gunn about drag coefficients and load limits now found themselves staring at photographs of burning Japanese destroyers, taken from the height of a ship's mast. They read the testimonials of pilots who had survived missions that would have been a death sentence in a standard glass-nosed plane. The argument stopped immediately. The factory production lines were ground to a halt. The tooling was completely redesigned. North American Aviation began rolling out the B-25J model. Gone was the vulnerable glass bombardier compartment. The new model came straight from the assembly line, with a solid metal prow housing 850 caliber machine guns, mounted exactly where Pappy Gunn had placed them in Brisbane. Furthermore, the fuselage skin was reinforced with heavier gauge aluminum to withstand the punishing recoil that Gunn's mechanics had discovered the hard way. The illegal, suicidal field modification had officially become the standard for the United States Army Air Forces. Pappy Gunn's innovation didn't just secure victory in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, it birthed an entirely new philosophy of aerial warfare, the side-firing gunship. Gunn didn't stop with the nose guns. Later in 1943, he began experimenting with mounting weapons that fired out of the side of transport aircraft, allowing them to orbit a target and pour down a continuous rain of lead. He even mounted a 75mm cannon, a literal field artillery piece, into the nose of a B-25, creating a flying tank destroyer. His relentless tinkering and refusal to accept the limitations of the instruction manual laid the groundwork for future weapon systems that defined American air power. The concept of mounting overwhelming firepower on a slow, stable cargo airframe led directly to the development of the C-130 Spectre gunship used in Vietnam, a cargo plane packed with miniguns and howitzers that orbits targets, raining fire from the sky. And the idea of building an entire aircraft around a massive, recoil-heavy gun system lived on in the design of the Amanus-10 Warthog, a jet built specifically to carry the massive GA Humanus-8 Avenger cannon, a weapon so powerful its recoil actually slows the jet down when fired, exactly like Pappy's B-25s. Paul Pappy Gunn survived the war, despite being shot down multiple times and earning a reputation as the man who simply couldn't be killed. He was finally reunited with his family when Manila was liberated in 1945. He never took a dime for his inventions. He never applied for a patent. In 1957, Pappy Gunn died the way he lived, flying. He was piloting a civilian transport plane in the Philippines when he flew into a severe thunderstorm and crashed. History tends to remember the generals who planned the battles and the aces who shot down enemy fighters. But sometimes, the most important man in the war isn't the one flying the plane or giving the orders. Sometimes it's the stubborn, chain-smoking mechanic in a grease-stained hangar who looks at a factory blueprint, picks up a welding torch and says, "I can do better." But there is one final chapter to Pappy Gunn's story. In 1952, 7 years after the war ended, Gunn received a letter postmarked from Yokohama, Japan. It was written in broken English by a man named Toshio Nakamura. Nakamura had been a 20mm gunner on the destroyer Arashio, the very first ship Major Larner's strafers had torn apart in the Bismarck Sea. Nakamura had survived by jumping overboard seconds before the forward magazine exploded. He wrote to Gunn because for 7 years, he had been haunted by a mystery. Japanese naval records listed the cause of his ship's destruction as an unknown American weapon system. Nakamura wasn't angry. He was just desperate to know. He asked, what kind of aircraft could do that? How many guns did it carry? Who designed it? Gunn wrote back. He enclosed a photograph of a B-25J Strafer, its blunt nose bristling with .850 caliber barrels. On the back of the photo, Gunn wrote a simple message. I built this in a hangar in Brisbane because I was tired of watching my boys die. I'm sorry it killed your friends, but I'm not sorry I built it. They exchanged letters for 3 years until Gunn's death. Nakamura never forgave the war, but he respected the mechanic who refused to accept defeat. If you believe the stories of men like Pappy Gunn deserve to be remembered, please leave a like below to help keep this history alive. And for more deep dives into the untold battles of World War II, hit the subscribe button. Thank you for staying with us. We'll see you on the next briefing.